My name's Sam Alexander. I'm a Presbyterian preacher. I have not preached for some time in a congregation. Probably some good reasons for that. I'm not always a good fit. I haven't even preached to this camera, though. It's been a while, and there's a reason for that. I've been stunned into silence. Been absolutely stunned by the political rhetoric, the social upheaval, the economic nightmare that is 2017 in the United States of America. It's deeply disturbing, and I don't want to be part of the division. I don't want to be part of what tears people apart. My instincts tell me it's not the way to go, tempting though it sometimes is when I read the daily tweets from, what's his name. But I'm not going to be silent now, and my reason for that is that I've come to believe that the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, has something to say to us at this point in time in the life of our nation. And I think it's a message that gets lost in all the rhetoric, and I'd like to at least do my part to unfold that message in a way that can be understood in our culture. I know that Paul's letter to the Romans is, kind of a hard sell, especially for our secular culture, and I understand that. I mean, for one thing, it's been used, enlisted in the culture wars. I mean, Paul's cultural context had him believing that there was a hierarchical relationship between men and women. Paul certainly believed that same-sex relationships were not in the eyes of God appropriate, but these were never his main point. These were examples he gave or just kind of the language that was all around him. And while I understand the frustration at those things, I think it's a mistake to miss the real point that the man is making. I mean, over the years, there have been moments when cultures have fractured, and it is, in fact, Paul's letter to the Romans that can provide kind of a clear path forward. It certainly happened 30s in Germany. In any case, I'd like to open up this letter and preach on it as we walk through this period of hard division and a fragile kind of national culture. Now, I also understand that Paul's written off because he believes in magic religion. God up there who's doing stuff kind of like a puppeteer, and our culture has rightly written that off and said, no, that's not the way we think. The trouble is that we've often thrown out the baby with the bathwater. We decide that, well, God's not like that, and therefore there's no God, or maybe we can't make any sense of it all. And so somehow the idea that there is a creator that has some position or some influence or some interaction with creation, that just gets put into the background. Well, I don't believe in magic. So what I'm going to talk about, I think you'll find, is the structures of creation, the way things seem to unfold. But I do think that if we listen to Paul, we don't have to take his worldview, but recognize the kinds of things that he saw. He seemed to have his finger on the pulse of creation. If we can do that, I think we can gain some wisdom and some hope. And that's what I'd like to try and do as I unfold these texts in this series of sermons. So let me start with the first few verses of Paul's letter to the Romans. The language is going to seem a little strange to the modern mind, and that's the way it is with ancient texts, but I'll see if I can't unfold over the next weeks, open up what the meaning might be. I'm Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ. I'm called to be an apostle, that is to say, a messenger, set apart for the good news of God. Good news which God promised beforehand through the prophets in the Holy Scriptures, that is to say, the Jewish Scriptures. Okay? This is a good news concerning God's Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, the designated Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead. That's Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship ourselves to bring about the obedience of faithfulness for the sake of his name among all of the nations. That's including yourselves who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. I've been trying to put my finger on the dread that I've been feeling over these months. What's the source of it? I was walking with a very good and old friend a couple of weeks ago, and as we were talking, I sort of put my own finger on it, and I said, I just can't believe that democracy in America seems fragile right now. I never would have dreamed that such a thing would happen. And yet it certainly seems as though that's the case. A fragile democracy. It's like our values have crumbled. You know, truth is tossed aside, doesn't seem to matter. Civility certainly is gone. The idea that we would be unified even in our differences, well, that's becoming a quaint little notion. Democracy is somehow fragile, and it's, come upon us this way, kind of slowly. You can't really put your finger on one thing that made it such, but, we can look at some major things that have happened over the last couple of decades, September 11th in 2001. We recognized, really for the first time in my lifetime, that we're vulnerable. We are vulnerable to attack. And there are people who are willing to attack us. The security of a nation was kind of shaken. And at first we began to act honorably, seeking out justice, but then we began to act out of real fear. The Patriot Act kind of moved us to become something we weren't, kind of a state that spies on itself. The Abu Ghraib scandal, it's horrifying, things that happened. We acted out of fear, got ourselves into wars that probably in retrospect, certainly in retrospect, were inappropriate. Long time coming, but that's not the only vulnerability. We found out that we were economically vulnerable. A bunch of bankers put together some mortgages and dubious mortgages at that, and everything was sort of put together in a way that the whole house of cards started to collapse because people acted unethically. And a lot of people, a lot of my friends, lost a whole lot of money. And that's not just, numbers on a page. That's money that was there to help people be secure as they moved later into life. We're economically vulnerable. It's not something I was brought up to believe would happen. Guess, it's a little naive. And then there's Katrina, and now Maria. And it seems to me as though what we see is that we're vulnerable. We can't fix every problem that comes. Okay, there are things that could have been done with Maria for absolute sure that really should have been done. Same with Katrina. But it's a huge problem. A huge undertaking to try and rebuild and to help people in that circumstance, and apparently we weren't up to the task. We were vulnerable. You put all these things together, and you begin to get a sense that this great quest that America had for great power and great influence, for the ability to stand on its own and become something of value and worth, this great prideful moment, this quest for dominance, really, turned out to be a bit of a sham. And as we felt that shame, at least this is how I see it, as we began to feel that, it uncovered some serious divisions in our country. Politicians have been playing off those divisions. A great deal of fear and anger and rage running back and forth between various parts of our culture. And it's gotten to the point that we're just kind of lobbing bombs at each other. Not all that interested in whether or not we can find some sort of unity. In fact, the reality is many people on both sides are just looking to tear the whole damn thing down. Doesn't matter if we lie. Truth doesn't matter. We can let the facts go. Civility, the kinds of social conventions that have allowed us to talk to one another, well, those things are disappearing too. The things that our president has said are completely unacceptable. They have been for years. And all of a sudden, he's getting away with it. Why? because a lot of people want to tear the whole thing down. Doesn't matter that those things are inappropriate, you know? And that would seem absurd if it weren't for the fact that the whole thing seems like a sham to them. It seems like the way things have played out, that great quest for power and influence, it ran far and only got a few people in a place of power. And it underserved a lot of the people. I understand why people want to tear it apart. We're afraid. We feel ashamed. And what we've created is a bit of a sham. And that often moves people towards anger and rage. It certainly happened here. In response to that nightmare, which has happened before, the Apostle Paul seems to have his finger on something else. What he recognizes is that human beings often gain their glory, gain their purpose, their meaning, from seeking power and influence, from seeking that great quest of being able to stand on one's own. And the trouble is that it always fails. It's almost in the nature of creation. You don't need an active God up there throwing lightning bolts around. The reality is that creation moves forward through death to new life. Things don't stay the same. And so as our culture shifts and we get a sense that it's crumbling, dying, so to speak, I ask the question, well, the real power of God, isn't that going to bring something new and fresh into the world? And I think the answer is yes, in spite of ourselves. So what Paul calls us to is to get our sense of worth and purpose and value by connecting to the power of God. Now, that's not some magic power that, as I say, throws around lightning bolts. No, this is built into the structures of creation. We'll call it the evolutionary impulse. I think that's how I'd like to describe it. And I can say why I think the text is moving in that direction. But it's moving towards a telos, towards an end. Always seeking the beauty and the value, always seeking the wholeness and the connection of creation. That's the movement of creation. That's what this power of God is about. And when we attach ourselves to that meaning, to that purpose, well, then we're on to something. We're on to something that is no longer fragile. Instead, it has enormous strength because it's built in to the powers of creation. We don't have to be afraid anymore. Oh, it's not that everything will go fine. It's that our worth and our purpose cannot be destroyed. Our value, the life we live, can be lived with hope because we can know that we are in the flow of that which is love. We are in the flow, not of gushy love, but of that creative impulse. That's our call. That's what Paul calls the obedience of faithfulness. Faithfulness to this God, this power, this impulse that carries creation forward through death to new life. This is not about service to self. That will crumble and fall. Service to this God is what brings us into hope and creative strength. That's the essential message of Paul, and we're going to be going over it over the next weeks. But I'd like you to consider that there's more than meets the eye in this creation. I know that our culture hasn't been thinking that way for a long time because the language we used for that had to do with a magic god, but there's more than meets the eye. It's moving towards the future, towards a beautiful future. Yes, that's a statement of faith. But if we seek connection to the power of God, to the power unfolding in creation itself, what we find is the joy and the hope of what Paul calls the gospel or the good news of God. I'd like you to consider that that's a possibility. That having rejected the purposes and the direction of creation for some time, we've gotten ourselves into a place where democracy is fragile, where the individuals in our nation are not living to their potential even a little. We're a nation that's hurting. It's happened before. But we're called to reach out and reach towards faithfulness to the one that brings beauty and hope and new life out of that that has destroyed our hearts.